Unless you've been living in isolation for the past 10 years or so, you've probably heard about manga, but what is it and what's the big deal? In this talk, I'd like to address a little bit of the history of manga and answer a few of the big questions that tend to come up when people ask me about it. So let's start at the very beginning. What is manga? Well, manga means comics that come from Japan, as opposed to comics that are made and produced in America or Europe. But in Japanese, manga can just mean comics. So let's take a step back and let me explain what I mean when I say comics. You might actually be surprised to know that there's a lot of debate as to what exactly makes comics. You think we know comics when we see them, but say what exactly is the difference between a comic and a picture book is harder to explain. The most famous definition of comics comes from Scott McCloud's book, Understanding Comics, in which he defines comics as juxtaposed pictorial and other images in deliberate sequence intended to convey information and/or to produce an aesthetic response in the viewer. Some historians argue that comics making goes back as far as the ancient Egyptians. Now, not hieroglyphs, that's actually a language system, but to their wall paintings. Those are pictures that had to be read in a certain order in order to be understood. Now, other scholars say that that definition is too broad, and comics don't really get started until we see certain features that help us understand and define comics, like speech balloons or panel borders. Pretty much everyone agrees, though, that modern comics, as we know them, get started in the mid to late 19th century with newspaper comics and editorial cartoons that start showing up in newspapers and funny magazines. Two of the most important elements in comics are the word and image combination, which I mentioned, and cartooning, or visual simplification. In Scott McCloud's book, Understanding Comics, which really is one of the best books if you want to get started understanding comics, he discusses the importance of cartooning to comics. He argues that comics are really powerful because of cartooning. Because a photo, a realistic image, can only be one person. But a smiley face, a cartoon, can be anybody. And therefore, cartoons have more universal appeal. On the one hand, this makes a lot of sense, and it's easy to agree with him. On the other hand, and this will bring us back to manga, cartooning and visual simplification is often really dependent on social and cultural traditions. So I'd like to address two of the main questions that I get when I talk about manga. And it turns out that the answers to these questions help us understand a little bit about the history of manga and how it became popular in the US. And the first of these has to do with how manga looks, its style. And that question is, why does manga look so different than US comics? Well, one of the most distinctive features of manga is its look. It does look really different than US and European comics. Most people point to the big eyes of its characters and their wild hair. Well, it turns out, I'd like to argue that the style of modern manga comes from a mix of the traditional aesthetics of Japanese art and the influence of US popular culture in the post-World War II period. Traditional Japanese art draws heavily on Chinese painting, which favored bold and flat ink lines. In addition, it also developed a different definition of what's important in art than Western art did. Western art favored realism, especially after the Renaissance, where it developed ideas about shading and three-point perspective. We think realism is natural, but in fact, visual realism in painting and drawing is a visual trick and not a reflection of reality. The idea that art should be realistic by mimicking nature or using these tricks, like three-point perspective, is a cultural ethos and not a deep universal truth. It's a style, like any other visual style. In addition to different cultural values regarding what art should look like, popular media in traditional Japanese art, like woodblock printing and ink painting, benefit from a simplified style that builds on outlines and flat blocks of color. As such, the concept of cartooning, or simplification, is embedded in the history of Japanese art in a way that had disappeared from Western art in the years after the influence of the European Renaissance. The word manga originated in the 17th century to describe whimsical or fantastical drawings, but came into its modern usage to describe comics or cartoons in the 19th century. Japan had been largely insular until about 1854, when it opened its doors more broadly to international influences. At this time, it began to import magazines and books, especially from the US and Europe. And at this point, its own traditions of art and cartooning came face to face with the growing form of cartooning and caricatures, especially in newspapers and funny magazines like Puck. Japanese artists began to make their own magazines like Tokyo Puck and Jiji Shimpo, and manga was born. It became very popular, and soon many of these comics and magazines became manga-only publications. These kind of publications grew in scope and popularity throughout the early 20th century, but as you might imagine, the onset of World War II brought a lot of innovation and creativity to a screeching halt. However, in the occupation period after World War II, manga as we know it is actually born. And a lot of this really comes down to one man, and his name is Osamu Tezuka. Tezuka is probably the most important mangaka or manga artist ever. In his lifetime, he wrote over 700 titles. Many of them were adapted into multiple TV and films. He is most famous for series like Astro Boy, Ribbon Knight, Blackjack, and Kimba the White Lion. His own influences, he states, are Japanese artists like Rakuten Kitazawa, who made Tokyo Puck, but also American artists brought in during the occupation like Walt Disney. And he has influenced pretty much every living manga artist today. In many ways, his style has become the defining style of modern manga. The massive influence of Tezuka's style on manga and anime, or Japanese animation, brings me to another point. I often get asked by Westerners why people in manga and anime look white. They think that because these characters have really big eyes and brightly colored hair, that they must be white. But if you ask Japanese people, they think that these characters look Japanese. Tezuka's style was indeed influenced by Disney. But his style has been so influential that that's just part of the manga style. And in fact, there are other cultural markers in manga style for white people. So in manga, big eyes and brightly colored hair don't necessarily indicate whiteness. This is one of the reasons I mentioned earlier. I have some issues with McLeod's argument that cartooning always is universal. In fact, there are actually cultural markers attached to the way that we simplify our characters. For example, big eyes don't always mean white. Moving on from Tezuka a little bit, although his influence is still felt here, it's important to note that manga publishing is very gendered. There are two main categories in manga publishing: shoujo, or girls manga, and shonen, or boys manga. Now, as you might expect, shoujo manga tends to focus on girl main characters, and the plots tend to be about relationships, friendship, and romance. Shonen manga, on the other hand, tends to feature boy main characters, and the plots tend to be more adventure-based and action-based. It doesn't just end with the plots, though. Over the years, different visual styles have developed as well. So in shoujo manga, the characters tend to be more lithe and ideally beautiful. They tend to have much bigger eyes and flowing long hair. Even the panels are different. They tend to be more permeable, and it's harder to tell sometimes where the panels end and where they begin. They also feature emotional imagery like flowers and nature scenes that don't really have anything to do with the plot, but let you know how the characters are feeling. Shonen manga, on the other hand, tends to use bolder, more obvious lines that sometimes are a little easier to read, but are more action-oriented. Now, I want to note that many girls love reading shonen manga, and many boys read shoujo manga, but these categories still exist and still exert a lot of influence on the publishing industry. Before I move on, I'd like to emphasize that even though I've tried to sort of explain where the manga style has come from and why manga perhaps looks different than Western comics, just like Western comics, there is an amazing depth and variety to the manga style. Yes, many manga artists, for example, were influenced by Tezuka, and you can see Tezuka's influence in their style. But now, many artists have been influenced by them, and their style has mutated and evolved, and more styles evolve. We have a beautiful depth and variety of styles in shoujo, in shonen, and it continues to change and grow every day. There's a style for everyone, and if you think you don't like manga style, you just haven't looked hard enough. So this brings us to the second question that I frequently get when I talk about manga. Why is manga backwards? Well, this question is ultimately a question about translation. As we've been talking about, manga is Japanese. And that means that in order to read it in English in the US, it needs to be translated. Now, the first manga translated into English in the US was Keiji Nakazawa's Barefoot Gen, and it was translated in 1978. That might seem pretty recent, especially considering what a big deal manga is in the US today. Even more shocking is that manga wasn't even really a big deal in US publishing until the 1990s. So in the 90s, when manga publishing began to take off, publishers were faced with an issue. Traditionally, Japanese is read from top to bottom and from right to left, which is the opposite of English, which is read from left to right. And that means that Japanese is backwards to English eyes. And this means that manga was backwards. Now, at this point, manga was not the big deal that it is today, and publishers were very worried that publishing it backwards meant that nobody would read it. So, the method that most publishers chose was to flip manga. Literally, they would mirror the images. This meant that a lot of artists actually chose not to have their work translated because they didn't want their artwork to be transformed. It also meant that any language on the page, logos, sound effects, signs in the background, would have to be erased and covered over. And artists also were unhappy with that. As I mentioned way back at the beginning of this talk, one of the really important parts of comics is the relationship between words and pictures. Now, when you're translating, you're already changing the nature of the words, right? You're changing them from Japanese to English. So you're already changing the relationship between words and pictures. And if you're flipping the images, then you're really changing the relationship between words and pictures. So you can understand why a lot of manga fans were really concerned about this process of flipping. And yet publishers weren't sure what to do. Anything else seemed really alienating, or it was very expensive or slow. I'll give you one example of why manga fans and artists were really skeptical of some of the early publishing practices of manga translation. This one comes from Akira, which was published when manga was still being flipped in the mid-90s. The big sound effect here tries to represent the roar of the falling scaffolding. The Japanese sound effects, those big white angular does in this case, look like they must be part of the picture as much as the character on the motorcycle or the falling building pieces. The sharp angles of the katakana, that's the name for the letters, look like a part of the scaffolding and they extend to the top of the ceiling to support this effect. That's not the case in the translated sound effect, which seems like it's just pasted on top of the image. The rumbling R's don't have the same architectural similarity to the scaffolding, and they don't go all the way up to the top of the panel to hold up the roof like the Japanese sound effect did either. This is a pretty classic example of why fans and artists resisted flipping for so long, and why the market for manga in the 90s was growing but very slowly. Now, in the early 2000s, one publisher called Tokyopop decided to take a gamble, what they called the 100% authentic manga line. They decided to try to publish manga unflipped, backwards. They also published it on cheaper paper and in a smaller size so that they could sell the books more inexpensively. They included a little guide explaining how to read the books, and this meant they also didn't have to erase or cover over sound effects or signs. And as you can see, if you go into any bookstore or comic book shop, the gamble paid off. This is how most manga is published in the US today. And many more artists are now also willing to allow their manga to be translated because of this. The new method isn't without its problems. A lot of people find it very alienating to read from right to left, and they might choose not to read manga because of that. I can say that while it is awkward at first, you do get used to it pretty quickly. And it's not perfect, but it is truer to the original text because you don't have to flip the images. And you do get to see some of the original language sound effects and signs. They don't get erased like they did in the original method. Take, for example, this image from Hajime Isayama's Attack on Titan. Unlike the Akira page, where the translation had to erase the original sound effects, translators can keep these sound effects now. Most people reading manga can't read Japanese, and that means that translators add subtitles to the sound effects. Sometimes this can be confusing or overwhelming, because there's a little too much to look at all at once. However, not only is it important to see the original word art of the sound effects, it can also be interesting if you're trying to learn Japanese. There's so much more to talk about when it comes to manga. So many more questions and issues to explore. For example, thinking about how the differences between the shoujo and shonen genres got solidified, or examining the massive impact that manga has had on American and French comics since the 2000s, or whether American comics that look like manga really can count as manga, or how publishing and translating practices determine what kinds of manga actually even get translated or brought to the US. But there's only so much time in this talk. Hopefully it's enough to get you started and to answer some of your most basic questions. Thanks for your time.